The race is on. Candidates to succeed Liz Truss as Prime Minister have until Monday to gather the support of 100 MPs. There's speculation about who may run, though no Conservative has as yet formally declared.
The party needs to find a leader to unite behind. Thank you very much.
Whoever wins the contest will be the country's third Prime Minister in just 2 months.
The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has this lunchtime ruled himself out. He says he's leaning towards supporting Boris Johnson, but Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt are drawing MPs' support too.
And opposition parties are saying it's time for a general election. We'll have the latest also this lunchtime. A gloomy picture for the UK economy. People are shopping less and government borrowing is hit its second highest September figure on record. There's gridlock in the health and social care system in England, says the regulator, as it warns about the impact of staff shortages.
I've been doing 60 hours. The only time off is actually a sleep day.
How long can you keep doing that?
Not long.
And we meet the first wild bison to be born in the UK for thousands of years.
Coming up in the sports later in the hour on the BBC News channel, can Scotland take the final spot in the Super 12s? We'll have the very latest from the T20 World Cup in Australia.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC's News at 1. Senior Conservatives hoping to become Prime Minister have begun seeking support from their fellow Tory MPs. They need to gain the backing of at least 100 colleagues in order to stand in the leadership race. Liz Truss resigned yesterday, though remains in Downing Street until a successor is appointed. That new leader will be named by next Friday at the latest, becoming the third Prime Minister in just 2 months. In the last hour, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has ruled himself out of the contest. Boris Johnson, who was forced out of number 10 just 6 weeks ago, could attempt a comeback. Liz Truss's former leadership rival, Rishi Sunak, is currently the bookmakers' favourite. The leader of the House of Commons, Penny Mordaunt, is also thought likely to stand, as is Suella Braverman, who resigned as Home Secretary earlier this week. And the International Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, could also run. Opposition parties have been arguing that there should now be a general election. This report from our political correspondent Helen Catt contains some flash photography.
I will remain as Prime Minister until a successor has been chosen. Thank you.
And with that, Liz Truss was out. As she headed off for a jog, the race to fill her shoes had already begun. Would-be successors are rushing to get enough support before the deadline of 2 p.m. on Monday. In the last hour, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, once touted as a possible unity candidate, has ruled himself out and said he'd lean towards supporting a bid by the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
He was legitimately sent into Parliament as the Prime Minister based on the vote of the whole electorate, not just on Tory members, not just on members of Parliament. That he got a mandate, and I think that's an important thing for all of us to bear in mind. We'll see what happens. Of course, unity is also important. I'll be looking for how the candidates are prepared to bring the party together, because without unity we can't govern either.
Mr Johnson resigned earlier this year after losing the support of a significant chunk of Conservative MPs. Some have suggested they would quit the party if he returned.
To go from the kamikaze budget under Liz Truss back to a man that his own party has declared is unfit for office is the most powerful argument you could possibly have for a general election, so that we can put the alternative case to the country, which is stability, growth, an economy that works for everyone, rather than this chaos.
To enter the leadership contest, each candidate needs the support of 100 Conservative MPs, so a maximum of 3 candidates. If there are more than 2 candidates, there is an MP's vote, and the candidate with the least number of votes is eliminated. When 2 candidates remain and one of them doesn't decide to drop out, Tory party members vote online. The winner becomes Prime Minister.
Morning, Mr Sunak.
The former Chancellor Rishi Sunak had over 100 MPs backing him over the summer. He's expected to run again this time, but hasn't yet confirmed. Likewise, the leader of the Commons, Penny Mordaunt.
Making a statement in due course.
Still no decisions from the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman.
Good morning.
Or another possible candidate from the right of the party, the International Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch.
My answer is still the same as it was yesterday. The party needs to find a leader to unite behind. Thank you very much.
As it stands, no candidate has said publicly that they will stand. Work is happening behind the scenes to gather support. Time, though, is short. Helen Catt, BBC News, Westminster.
And let's get the very latest this lunchtime from our political correspondent, Damian Grammaticus, and give us a sense of where it's all at this lunchtime and what happens now, Damian.
Well, it's all very much up in the air at the minute while we wait for these candidates to put themselves forward, so none doing that so far. And they, behind the scenes, their teams or their supporters, canvassing, trying to work out where the numbers lie. That very high bar, 100 MPs that you have to get to nominate you, that I think is sort of concentrating mind. So you see on the right of the party, as Helen was saying there, looking at whether there will be a candidate coming from there or a couple of candidates possibly. And then you have this intervention by Ben Wallace today, which is very interesting because remember back in the summer, Ben Wallace touted as a potential leadership candidate himself as a sort of possible unifying figure. He did not stand in the summer. He was one of the last cabinet ministers to declare his support for Liz Truss back in the summer. This time he's out of the blocks early, indicating he would have a preference for Boris Johnson. But that possibility is causing real disquiet amongst a lot of Tory MPs. They remember the situation they were back in a few months ago. To give you an example of flavour there, Jesse Norman, who is a minister in the Foreign Office, he said choosing Boris now would be, he says, I say this advisedly, an absolutely catastrophic decision. Others, though, Jacob Rees-Mogg has already come out and said that he is backing Boris. Nobody yet throwing their hat officially in the ring, but all of this positioning happening over this weekend.
Damian, thank you for now, Damian Grammaticus. Well, as the public comes to terms with the prospect of a new Prime Minister, our correspondent Phil Mackey has been gauging reaction in the town of Bridgnorth in the Conservative-held constituency of Ludlow in Shropshire.
So it would be weird, you know, if Boris does come back.
There's only one thing they're talking about in Bridgnorth today.
I'll take Boris back. Certainly don't need a general election.
It's not easy for ordinary voters, so imagine what it's like if you're a Conservative councillor.
We've been through every emotion, let's be honest, over the last few weeks. You go from anger to frustration to despair, and then I think yesterday there was a sense of relief, and relief because this couldn't continue. You know, for every hard-working Conservative councillor, it was embarrassing, and we are now relieved that we've got a reset chance. We've got to take that and get it right.
But the membership got it wrong last time.
Yeah, but we have got to reflect on the mess of the last 2 weeks. People are in crisis. We're facing a really difficult winter. You know, their friendships and politics aside, they need to come together and unite now and get behind the party and get on with the policies and what they need to deliver.
It's the main point of talk in the pub.
At the Crown on the High Street, the price of a pint has had to go up by 20p and staff are working reduced hours.
What do you think? You're somebody who's voted Conservative in the last couple of elections, used to be a Labour voter. Where are you now?
Floating is the best way to describe it. Completely undecided. I just think we need some form of unity. With Boris, he has been tainted with the Partygate, that sort of stuff. So I'm not sure whether we need someone fresh.
Thank you.
I spent most of last night trying to think, would I have Boris back? Wouldn't I? And I really can't say whether I've decided yes or not.
Bridgnorth, like the constituency it's in Ludlow, has been Conservative held for generations. But 2 weeks ago, there was a county council by-election here, which was won by Labour. And so that's a worry for the Conservative Party. It's a sign maybe that it needs to reconnect with its core voters.
All that is obviously brought local.
Next door, butcher Mike Pearce remains a party loyalist, but even he's not happy.
They've just got to buck their ideas up, because one will say one thing and mean something else. It doesn't happen, because everybody now is fed up to the high teeth with the Conservatives.
Would you vote Labour?
No, I wouldn't. I'd still vote Conservative.
They're playing for high stakes in Westminster, but the Conservatives need to calm an increasingly frustrated Middle England. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Bridgnorth.
So what's been the reaction around the UK to Liz Truss's downfall and the contest to find her replacement? In a moment, we'll hear from Hal Griffith in Cardiff and Alexandra Mackenzie in Glasgow. Let's go first, though, to our island correspondent Chris Page in Belfast. Chris.
Well, Jane, there are now two questions hanging over politics in Northern Ireland. Number one, who will be the Prime Minister by next Friday? And number two, will Northern Ireland be heading into an election next Friday? Not a general election, at least not yet, but an election to the devolved Assembly. To go back a little bit, Northern Ireland hasn't had a fully functioning devolved government since February, and the Democratic Unionist Party says it'll continue to block the formation of a power-sharing coalition until the Brexit trade border with the rest of the UK is removed. The legal deadline for the formation of a devolved government is next Friday, and the current Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, has said if there's no breakthrough by then, and that seems unlikely, he will be calling another election, just 7 months after Northern Ireland last went to the polls. Of course, events in London have added a huge degree of uncertainty. For example, will there be another cabinet reshuffle next week? Could there be just a general change of tack on the government's part? For now, the parties are assuming they will be going back to the voters on probably the 15th of December, but Stormont feels like it's in an even greater state of limbo.
All of the party leaders here in Scotland said Liz Truss made the right decision to resign. The leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Douglas Ross, he said, "We must now move forward quickly, and the new leader and Prime Minister will need to restore stability for the good of the country." Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, described this as an almighty mess. She said a general election is a democratic necessity, but she also said that an election doesn't solve the problem here in Scotland. She said the democratic case for independence is growing by the hour of Liz Truss. She said that she would at most be a footnote in history. Now, we understand there was no formal communication between Liz Truss and Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon has said she will now wait till whoever is the fifth Prime Minister since she became First Minister. She said of Boris Johnson, it would be ludicrous to think that he could come back to number 10.
Welsh Tory MPs have come back to their constituencies to take the temperature and probably feel a bit of heat. There is some public anger when they speak to their constituents. They will hear that call for a general election being echoed back to them. But of course, if that were to happen, when you look at the polls at the moment, all 14 Welsh Tory general election seats could be wiped off the map. So who do those MPs want as their next leader and ultimately the next Prime Minister? Well, fewer than half of the 14 have actually publicly declared, but so far they seem to be going in favour of Rishi Sunak. Simon Hart, the man who was Welsh Secretary under Boris Johnson and played a part in his downfall in the final 48 hours, he's backing Rishi Sunak. The current Welsh Secretary doesn't have a constituency in Wales, but Robert Buckland also backing Rishi Sunak. But don't underestimate the support for Boris Johnson here. Some MPs in north of Wales can thank him for their seats because he helped to turn several of those seats blue back in 2019.
Al, thank you very much. Well, as the leadership contest gets underway, the state of the economy continues to impact lives. New figures show government borrowing rose in September. Borrowing, the difference between spending and tax income, was £20 billion last month, up £2.2 billion from a year earlier. That's the second highest September borrowing since monthly records began in 1993. And retail sales figures experienced a bigger than expected monthly fall of 1.4%. And meanwhile, the UK's financial services regulator has estimated that nearly 8 million people are finding their bills a heavy burden. The survey by the Financial Conduct Authority was carried out between February and June.
With consumer confidence now close to a 50-year low, the crowds at shopping centres are thinner. In September, retail sales were down by more than expected, 3.2% below where they were before coronavirus. Normally, the value and the volume of retail sales move together, but because of much higher prices, the amount shoppers are spending rose 12%, but the goods that money bought was down. Prices are putting customers off, like fish, up 13.5%.
Each customer, they're still buying, but instead of buying that much, they're buying that much.
and you hear tales of woe from some businesses which have had the bills in of massive increases which are simply unsustainable. So that is the one thing that we are concerned about business-wise.
While some corporations are banking record profits, 40% of small businesses like those here at Birmingham Indoor Market don't expect to make any profit this year.
We try and absorb the impact as much as we possibly can. You play the long game, so it's 52 weeks in a year and you have to look after your customers.
Figures from the financial watchdog suggest it's not the government's deficit, but those of households that are getting unmanageable, with 4.2 million people missing bills or loan payments in the first half of this year. Government borrowing, by contrast, has dropped rapidly since the pandemic, without any tax rises or spending cuts as the economy bounced back. But that's before the government starts to spend tens of billions subsidising energy bills.
In the current financial year, I think it's understandable that the government needs to step in and help people with their energy bills at considerable costs to the Exchequer. What really matters is over the medium term that we get the public finances back on track, so that once these energy schemes expire and they're no longer needed, we have appropriate decisions over tax and on spending to give markets confidence.
On the markets, the pound has dropped again, and shares in UK companies are down on reports that the new fiscal plan might get pushed back to November, all because of the new Tory leadership race. Andy Verity, BBC News.
And of course, you can keep up to date with all the latest news from Westminster and about the economy. It's all on our live page on the website, bbc.co.uk/news. I promise I did give you the correct address. The time is very nearly 17 minutes past 1, our top story this lunchtime. Senior Conservatives are deciding whether to enter the race to become the next Prime Minister following the resignation of Liz Truss. Any contender will need the support of 100 Conservative MPs in order to run.
Coming up in the sport in the next 15 minutes on the BBC News channel, there's been a fourth Premier League sacking of the season, defeat at Fulham, marking the end of Steven Gerrard's 11 months at Aston Villa.
The health and social care system in England is gridlocked. That's the warning from the Care Quality Commission. The regulator says it's seen a significant rise in the last year in the number of people stuck in hospital because there isn't any social care provision for them when they leave, either at home or in the community. The CQC says staff shortages is one of the main reasons, although the government says it is investing money in recruitment and training. Here's our social affairs editor, Alison Holt.
Whitby in rural North Yorkshire is one of many places feeling the impact of what the regulator describes as a gridlocked health and care system in England. This is one of just 2 nursing homes in the area. There is constant demand for them to take patients ready to be discharged from local hospitals to free up beds there. But the home's manager says they just can't find enough staff.
As of this afternoon, we'll have 16 residents. We can have up to 24. So we have a lot of empty rooms, but we are heavily reliant at the moment on agency staff, which have been fantastic. But I would be quite nervous about taking on any extra residents because we wouldn't properly be able to meet their needs.
The home was facing closure earlier this year, but the local council persuaded the current provider to take it on with some restrictions. Without this place, there would have been worryingly few nursing beds locally, and Joan, who's lived here for 12 years, would have had to find a new home.
I was very disturbed. I wasn't cross because there wasn't anything I could do except protest to whoever was listening, and that was nobody.
Today's report by the Care Quality Commission warns of alarmingly high staff vacancies in health and care in England, with 300,000 unfilled jobs, more than half of them in social care. It says 500,000 people are waiting for council care services, and 3 in 5 patients end up stuck in hospitals waiting for support in the community.
We recently brought together 250 leaders across health and social care who are currently operating out there in the system, and they described it as a system in crisis.
Are you ready for handover? Yeah.
It's existing staff who have to fill in the gaps. Ken is one of 4 nurses at the Whitby home. They really need 6.
In the terms of the last 4 weeks,
we've had people on annual leave, so I've been doing 60 hours. And you think I'm doing 4 night shifts and 2 day shifts. The only time off is actually a sleep day.
How long can you keep doing that?
Not long.
The government says its own plans for health and care address the priorities highlighted by the CQC and that it's putting extra money into the recruitment and training of staff. Alison Holt, BBC News, Whitby.
And our health editor Hugh Pym is with me, and there is another example of a really big issue facing a new Prime Minister.
Well, that's right, Jane. It's a familiar but a bleak reminder of what's really going on, and it's right across the system, as Alison has been explaining there, health and social care. If it's difficult to find rehabilitation options for people in the community or home care, then they're going to be stuck in hospital beds. That means new patients coming in. It's harder to find them beds in the hospitals. Hospitals are pretty nearly full in England. That's the picture from the data we're getting. And A&E units then get very crowded with some patients on trolleys, and ambulances have to queue up because they can't hand over patients because there's nowhere to put them. It is a really big problem with winter approaching, and there are no quick fixes for whoever the new Prime Minister is. There has been some foreign recruitment to try and bring in more social care staff. There's been more attempt to coordinate hospitals working together, so if one's very busy, others can take on patients, but it is a really, really big challenge.
Yes, and you talk about winter coming, we shouldn't forget about COVID either.
Yes, we've got COVID and flu adding to the pressures on the NHS. The latest figures today from the Office for National Statistics for the UK show the number of infections in the week up to October the 10th, 2 million, up 14.7% on the previous week. That's a slight slowing of the rate of increase, but obviously a high figure. When you look at hospital admissions, though, with COVID, the latest figures we've got are for England. It's a slightly different picture. They're a bit more up to date, as it happens, and they show that there were 7,800 or just over hospital admissions with COVID in the last 7 days. That was down on the previous 7 days by 4.7%. So the hope is that COVID's not proving quite as much of an issue as some had predicted, though clearly it hasn't gone away. Flu, though, officials are concerned. They're showing an increase earlier in the season than they would expect, more hospital admissions, particularly amongst young children and the elderly, and officials are urging parents to take up the offer of vaccinations for their children where eligible and appropriate, and certainly others who are vulnerable ahead of flu maybe getting even higher.
All right, Hugh, thank you very much. Hugh Pym. The Labour MP for Chester, Christian Matheson, has resigned after an independent panel found that he had carried out serious sexual misconduct while in office. The panel upheld 2 allegations against him made by a former member of his staff. He denies the allegations. Police have said that human remains found in the loft of a house in Milton Keynes have been identified as the missing teenager Leah Croucher. A post-mortem examination, which was carried out last week, has been inconclusive as to the cause of her death. Investigations are continuing. Plaid Cymru begin their party conference in Llandudno today. The leader, Adam Price, will outline what he's calling his people's plan to cut energy prices, freeze private rents and make public transport cheaper, although the party hasn't yet outlined to the BBC how it would fund the proposals. Plaid are in a cooperation agreement with Welsh Labour in the Senedd and came third in last year's Welsh Parliament election. The United States says Iran has sent military experts to Russian-occupied Crimea to help launch drone attacks on Ukraine. Kyiv was struck by a wave of so-called kamikaze drones on Monday. Tehran denies supplying the weapons to Russia. It comes as Ukraine's president accuses Russia of planning to destroy a dam in the Kherson region. Our Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse, is in the southern city of Kryvyi Rih, and he sent this report about how Moscow is targeting key infrastructure.
A new kind of patrol for the police officers of Kryvyi Rih. On the lookout not for criminals or Russians, but people using outside lighting. A sushi restaurant gets a surprise visit and a photo before a switch is flicked.
The aggressor wants to damage our energy system.
That's why the city is doing its best to provide sufficient level of energy supply for people's daily lives.
70 properties were cut off for not following the rules.
It's only 7:30 and it feels like the curfew has already started. There are some street lights on, but the city is gradually falling dark. And this is what escalation looks like now. Through targeting Ukraine's infrastructure, the Russians are taking away more freedoms from people, making life that bit more difficult, especially with winter approaching.
Kryvyi Rih, along with the whole of Ukraine, is being forced to either ration energy or shut it down.
We've cut off streetlights by 60%. 50% of electric transport isn't operating. We've cut power for all sports and cultural buildings. Now we're finishing switching off any outside banners. And we also ask people to cut their electricity consumption.
Iran is helping Russia with its invasion, according to the US, providing training as well as these attack drones made by Tehran, deployed by Moscow. Both countries deny it. Where Russia is going backwards in the southern Kherson region, Kiev has accused it of planting explosives on this key dam. Ukraine still has momentum, but progress isn't simple. James Waterhouse, BBC News, Kryvyi Rih.
Now to cricket, and Ireland are through to the Super 12 stage of the T20 World Cup. But it wasn't good news for Scotland. Andy Swiss was watching.
There it is, the victory in fine style.
For Ireland's travelling fan club, the World Cup journey rolls on after a day and a win to remember. To reach the next stage, they had to beat the West Indies. Two-time champions, remember, but how Ireland seized their chance.
That's a good catch.
First, their bowlers restricted the West Indies to 146, but turned their run chase into more of a stroll. The result means that while the West Indies go out, Ireland go through to the main 12-team stage, where they'll be hoping more upsets lie in store. It was win or bust for Scotland too. They had to beat Zimbabwe, but Scotland's batters were soon struggling. Wesley Madaveri getting Zimbabwe off to a flyer as Scotland made just 132. Could their bowlers turn things round? Well, briefly it seemed they might. 3 quick wickets and the comeback was on, but not for long, as Zimbabwe held their nerve and held on for victory. Their World Cup continues while Scotland's is over on a day of contrasting cricketing emotions. Andy Swiss, BBC News.
Now, the first wild bison for thousands of years has been born in the UK. 3 bison were released back in July as part of a rewilding project in Kent. But unknown to the rangers, one of them had a passenger on board. Jonah Fisher has been to see the new arrival.
Oh, man, she's like a ray of sunshine on a dark, cloudy day.
It's thousands of years since a bison was born in the wild in Britain. So this is quite a moment in Kent's Blean Woods. Europe's largest mammal, once hunted almost to extinction, taking her first steps.
She's a little ball of energy, and she when she sees when we get a little bit of rain, she starts sprinting around, and it's what's the stuff falling out of the sky? She's fantastic. She's doing so well.
Donovan oversaw the arrival of the first 3 bison in July. As part of the settling in process, he brings them some extra food every morning.
It's basically a little treat, but that is the menu, what you see out there.
These bison are not free to roam. Under UK law, they've rather unfairly been classed as dangerous animals, which means they have to be surrounded by this rather big fence. But inside the enclosure, they forage, they graze, they look for food. And in the next few months, the enclosure is going to be massively expanded, leaving the bison to effectively live as wild animals inside.
The role of the bison is to act as nature's bulldozer, trampling corridors through the forest and killing trees by eating their bark. In the clearings, light can come through, and there are spaces for other wildlife to thrive.
They are, in effect, an animal that will coppice trees, will do all of that sort of work that we do manually with chainsaws or with brush cutters or whatever. They will do all this naturally through their behaviour.
Where would you like to see this project go?
In time, the greatest aspiration would be to drop the fences, leave the fencing alone and let the bison move through a native English landscape as they were intended.
Do you think that's really realistic?
I do.
So this baby bison could be just the beginning. Jonah Fisher, BBC News in Kent.
Let's take a look at the weather prospects now. Here's Thomas Schaffenacker. Hello.
Hi there, Jane. Good afternoon to you. It's going to stay mild over the next few days, but big downpours lurking on the horizon today. And indeed, the weekend is going to be quite changeable as well. Certainly not a washout. We've got some sunshine on the way, but it will change. This is what the satellite picture looks like right now, and quite a complicated sort of pattern of clouds. You can see various vortices, various low pressure swirling around the UK, and the air is crucially also coming in from the south, from the southern climes, so hence it feels so mild out there. And as we go through the weekend, you'll see areas of low pressure sweeping across the UK, bringing further outbreaks of rain, so that very changeable autumnal picture. Now the temperatures today, 19 in London, more typical in the mid-teens, but you know, the average, for example, in London this time of the year is closer to 14 degrees, so we are well up there, and that really isn't going to change much over the next few days. So let's have a look at the showers crossing the Midlands into northern England, quite a few of them across Northern Ireland to later on, quite cloudy across Scotland, but the showers aren't especially heavy here right now. And then actually towards the end of the night, what we'll find is that the weather is going to dry out across many parts of England and Wales. And again, the overnight temperatures, look at that, 14 in Norwich, 12 degrees in Belfast. So it's not mild just by day, but particularly the nights, very mild indeed. Now tomorrow, best of the weather or sunniest of the weather across England and Wales, although we will see some showers reaching southwestern areas later in the afternoon. Northern Ireland and Scotland tomorrow, I think more cloudy and a chance of catching one or two showers as well. And then Sunday, it changes again. We see these weather fronts swirling around that bigger area of low pressure that I showed you earlier on the satellite picture. You can see clumps of rain sweeping across the UK during the course of Sunday. And again, a good chance of catching one or two downpours. Despite all of this, still 18 in London, around about 14 expected in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, and not far off that also in Belfast. And the low pressure, rather a large one across the Atlantic, is still with us into Monday. So this pattern, this mild, changeable, showery pattern is going to continue into Monday. Again, highs in the high teens, particularly there in the southeast, and the mid-teens across northwestern areas of the UK. And then the outlook into next week shows that really varied pattern. Again, I was talking about this yesterday, lots of weather icons depicting all sorts of weather there, mild both in the south and relatively mild in the north as well.
Thomas, thank you very much. And that is it from the news at 1 for today. On BBC One, we'll join our news teams now wherever you are. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Done it.